Video game storytelling has become increasingly complex over the years as developers put more focus into creating memorable narratives. While video games were initially designed to be fun and challenging, the industry evolved towards balancing both gameplay and story and creating a unified experience. As such, developers began designing narratives that were diverse, were heavily emotional, and tackled difficult issues. This combined with games transitioning away from strict linear experiences and letting the player choose how they wanted to progress, which gave them agency over the direction a game's story would take. And perhaps no company was more synonymous with this movement towards complex, choice-driven narratives than Telltale Games. For years, Telltale released episodic video games that centered around story and characters before the company hit pay dirt with The Walking Dead. Seemingly overnight, Telltale went from an obscure developer to a video game powerhouse and one of the most recognized names in the industry. In this retrospective, we'll be looking at Telltale's Walking Dead games, analyzing their stories, dissecting how they evolved over the years, and examining their ups and downs. This is The Walking Dead, the Telltale series.
No more, please! No more, please! Please!
The story of Telltale Games begins with LucasArts, a company who, from the 80s to the 2000s, produced several highly respected graphic adventure games for MS-DOS, Mac, and Windows. Adventure games of the time had, and still have, a reputation for featuring detailed storylines, infuriating logic puzzles, and punishing death scenes, especially games from companies like Sierra and Revolution Software. LucasArts stood out by making adventure games without any ways to lose, as well as generally being on the light-hearted side, which has led to their games sometimes being favored over other contemporary titles. However, the adventure game market began to decline in the late 90s and was nearly dead by the 2000s, so in 2004, LucasArts halted production on adventure games, with much of their staff moving on to other companies. 3 of these employees, Ken Bruner, Dan Connors, and Troy Molander, went on to form Telltale Games later that year and began developing games that would be released episodically, with episodes coming out individually months apart from each other. Telltale's strategy centered not around creating their own stories, but rather securing the license for popular intellectual properties and developing games based around them. Initially, they were stuck with smaller or more obscure franchises like Sam & Max, CSI, Homestar Runner, Wallace & Gromit, and Monkey Island. While these games were generally well received by fans of the series, none of them hit mainstream success, which made it difficult for Telltale to stay afloat considering the high costs of licensing and the fact that the companies self-published all their games. In 2010, it seemed like their fortunes were turning, as they signed a deal with NBC Universal to make games on 2 lucrative properties, Back to the Future and Jurassic Park. These games had a larger audience since they attracted a dedicated fan base, and also opened up the door for Telltale to land even bigger contracts. That eventually led them to The Walking Dead. In 2011, Telltale announced that they had signed 2 deals to develop games based on noteworthy comic book series, one of which was the urban fantasy comic Fables, which eventually turned into The Wolf Among Us. The other was The Walking Dead, a post-apocalyptic zombie series co-created by Robert Kirkman, the founder of Skybound Entertainment. The comics had been going on for 8 years, and AMC had recently released the first season of its hit TV series based on the comics, so it was already a popular property by this point, and one that had not yet been adapted to video games. Telltale pitched Kirkman a game based less around killing zombies, but around making and living with difficult choices, an idea that Kirkman liked. Kirkman worked with Telltale to craft a narrative that fit within the Walking Dead universe, and instead of taking characters from the comics or show, almost all of the game's characters are original. Telltale took advantage of the episodic release of the game to adjust their game and story design as the series progressed, particularly by considering what choices players tended to make. For instance, while early episodes had more puzzles, later episodes focused more on narrative sequences because players responded better to them. Telltale kept a running record of player statistics, revealing how a person's choices compared to that of other players at the end of each episode. The designers strive to have as many choices end up in an even split between players as possible, though whenever a major choice was more one-sided, Telltale knew that they could focus on developing paths that more players were going down. It also prompted them to add new scenes that would make players rethink or regret earlier decisions in the game. If players found that they didn't like a certain character, Telltale would add a part in a later episode where that character would attempt to redeem themselves or would be in danger, giving the player a moral conundrum. This would be the defining element that helped launch Telltale's first Walking Dead game, later known as The Walking Dead Season 1, to instant success on a level the company hadn't seen yet. This game was the beginning of Telltale's glory days, and it all started with a police car driving out of Atlanta. Season 1 follows the adventures of Lee Everett, who's living in Georgia right at the start of a worldwide outbreak of reanimated corpses known primarily as walkers. After first encountering the walkers, Lee meets a girl named Clementine, who's been surviving on her own while her parents are away, and the two decide to stick together. The pair soon encounter more survivors attempting to flee Georgia and join them in order to survive the infestation of the dead. Season 1 builds on classic adventure game mechanics by solidifying gameplay that complements a narrative-heavy, emotional experience. Puzzle solving and inventory management are put on the back burner, and instead the focus is on cutscenes and selecting dialogue options for Lee. In previous Telltale games, players could bounce back and forth between locations on a whim, but The Walking Dead removes a lot of exploration in favor of directing the player through a series of scenes that played through sequentially. This delivers a more emotionally driven narrative that doesn't wait for the player to initiate the next part of the story, but continues moving regardless of whether or not the player is ready for it. For nearly all of the game's dialogue choices, the player has a limited time to respond, which puts an added pressure on the player to make tough decisions that will have an effect on the characters and future events. With the odd exception, if the player doesn't choose an option, Lee will remain silent and the game keeps going, hence the often repeated phrase, "silence is a valid option." For tense situations, the game transitions into action scenes that require the player to perform QuickTime events, or else Lee or another essential character will die and you get a game over. Despite the heightened sense of danger, these often aren't that intense because they typically don't lead to any noticeable consequences. You have to play these sections a certain way, hitting the right inputs at the right time, or else the game won't move on, whereas with character interactions, there is no definitive right way to proceed. The Walking Dead's gameplay is simple, and although it marks a significant evolution from Telltale's earlier games, it is not a complex game to play. Rather, the complexities come from the story, the world building, and the relationships between the game's characters. The gameplay is more of a foundation to communicate the narrative and not something meant to stand out on its own. It's something that only slightly changes over the series, which means it isn't something worth covering in depth. Telltale put their efforts into designing the narrative and characters so that they weren't straightforward and highlighted the tough decisions that the player has to make. Those choices aren't just a means to advance the game, it's how the game builds its cast of survivors, and nowhere is that more prevalent than with the game's two protagonists. The backbone of Season 1 is the bond between Lee and Clementine, two strangers who come together by chance right as the world begins to turn. The two of them travel together in order to reach safety, and in the process create a connection that resembles a close familial relationship. That bond gives the two of them a reason to keep going as the situation around them grows dire, especially since they lost people who were close to them and witnessed so many gruesome events. Lee and Clementine are played by Dave Fennoy and Melissa Hutchinson, who give great performances that sell the bond between them, establishing a relationship that becomes a bright light in a world filled with darkness.
Before I met you and before the plague, I killed somebody.
Oh, so that's what...
Yeah, that's it. It was a bad thing and there's no explaining it.
Why are you telling me?
Because I didn't want to keep it to myself anymore.
It's an unlikely relationship that never would have blossomed if the walkers hadn't happened, but when you look back on it, you realize the connection they formed was the most important thing for either of them. It seems like a weird relationship at first, when you consider both Lee's history prior to the game's events and Clementine's nature as a young kid. When we first see Lee, he's being escorted to prison after being convicted of murdering a Georgia state senator who was having an affair with Lee's wife. We see glimpses of Lee suffering with the memory of killing the senator, but after the zombies are introduced, this aspect of his character is pushed aside as more immediate dangers threaten him and the people around him. That may seem like an odd choice, as it almost makes his crime seem unimportant, and, well, yeah, it does, and that's the point. It doesn't matter what Lee or any of these characters did before the walkers, because the zombie apocalypse creates a brand new world, and it causes several people to become shadows of their former selves. People who used to be nice turn violent because they feel they have to adapt to be cruel and uncompromising, and conversely, characters with dark histories can redeem themselves in the zombie apocalypse, helping others to survive through the ordeal that they all share. That's why Lee murdering the senator doesn't matter in the context of how the player views him. Whatever Lee or any character did in the past is unimportant. What matters is what they become after the apocalypse becomes the new normal. Aside from his crime, Lee is a clean slate for the player to make their own decisions on how he should act. It's sort of misleading to say that Lee's personality is shaped by the player, because choices have a greater impact on character relationships than it does on Lee as a person. No matter how you play the game, Lee is generally a strong leader and a good person, but the player can direct him to be outwardly dismissive or aggressive to people as they so choose. While this comes at the cost of defining Lee as a solid character, it lets the player step into his shoes and use Lee as a surrogate for their own mindset. Lee and the other playable protagonists in the franchise act as vessels for the player with which they can communicate with the NPCs and forge their own relationships with them. That's the real crux to the choices, not how they change Lee's personality, but how the characters think of Lee and how they respond to his actions. And nowhere is this more crucial than with Clementine. Clementine is a young girl left alone when the outbreak begins, and when Lee finds her, he assumes the role of her guardian and father surrogate. Lee, and by extension the player, is responsible not only for helping her stay alive, but also educating her on how to survive in the zombie invasion. Clementine is only 8 years old when Lee finds her, and while she is old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, it's harder for her to adapt to a world gone mad. She doesn't yet have a comprehension of concepts like loss, betrayal, violence, and death, but she's forced to confront those concepts directly while traveling with Lee, and he's responsible for helping Clementine understand what people are doing and why. Clementine is very impressionable, and you feel the need to guide her the right way, showing her what it takes to survive and letting her know when something is wrong, even if it seems like the right thing to do. That sometimes means forbidding her to do something she wants to do or confiding in her that something the player did was bad. These interactions ultimately transform Clementine into who she becomes, and while her story in Season 1 is excellent, it's when you see her transform into a tough but compassionate young woman by the end of the series that makes helping her feel worth it. Clementine's role in Season 1 is chiefly to serve as the player's moral conscience, because as much as the player tries to prevent it, Lee is going to make a decision that negatively affects someone. By talking to Clementine about what's going on, it not only helps the player bond with her, but also can help the player resolve internal conflicts they have about the choices they've made. Through Season 1, Clementine remains a beacon of hope for the crew, as while they suffer through terrible situations, she never loses hope that things will work out for the best. That is, until the end of the game. Season 1's final scene is the culmination of Lee and Clementine's relationship and the start of her shift into the person she becomes. When Lee begins to succumb to his walker bite, he realizes he needs to let Clementine go, and that she needs to survive on her own from here on out. This scene isn't just a grim, heartbreaking ending, but it also serves its purpose as a conclusion to Lee's role in Clementine's life. By reaching this point, Lee has successfully guided Clementine through the first part of her journey, but from this point on, she needs to be on her own. At some point, Clementine needs to be able to fend for herself, and she can't rely on Lee and the player to guide her forever. So she has to both literally and metaphorically cut Lee out of her life, not only leaving his body behind, but also leaving to experience the world on her own and come to terms with the realities of everything that's happened.
You're strong, Clem. You can do anything.
But I'm little.
Doesn't mean nothing. You're gonna see bad stuff, but it's okay.
The connection between Lee and Clementine is really the heart of Season 1, and while it will always end in tragedy, the bond Lee and Clementine share is everlasting. And even years after Season 1's release, their relationship remains a defining aspect to the series. For most of the season, Lee and Clementine travel with a group of people that have banded together to survive, but are also often at each other's throats as the situation grows more dire. The game takes place in the first 3 months following the start of the outbreak, and in that time, the characters have learned a lot about how to stay alive, but have yet to come to terms with the world they now live in. That contributes heavily to the game's apocalyptic feel, as most survivors are either individuals or a small isolated group, and while we see plenty of them later in the series, there aren't many true communities in Season 1. Many people are able to survive the zombie infestation, but survival is only one part of the human equation. Society as we understand it doesn't have a meaning anymore because these characters haven't accepted that the walkers are a part of their lives yet. This will change in later seasons, but in the immediate aftermath of the infestation, the surviving humans have become confused, bitter, and angry. That makes it all the harder for Lee to remain on good terms with everybody, especially when things come to a head. As I mentioned, the characters' relationships with Lee can vary wildly depending on what he does and how he treats them. And because of the choices you need to make, it's impossible to go through the game without hurting somebody or losing favor with a character you've built up a strong relationship with. These characters are all flawed in their own ways and make mistakes and lapses in judgment, which makes it hard to side with them on every issue. Kenny, for example, is quick to anger and will argue mercilessly with people who disagree with him, and since he constantly comes up with plans and solutions, the player often has to decide whether or not to agree with him. Even though Lee is just one voice of many in the group, it is ultimately up to the player how events play out, and the relationships they forge with the characters that determine the kind of person Lee becomes. The biggest indicator of the effect players have on this is the bar of text in the top left corner that often tells you that a character will remember this. This text has been mocked and satirized countless times because of how prevalent it is, but in retrospect, it is an effective method of communicating what the game is looking at when you make a choice. While some of the critical decisions are more obvious than others, it can sometimes be difficult to discern when the player's done something that can affect the rest of the game. They will remember this as a marker that indicates that something you've done is being tracked by the game and that it may influence later events. It signifies which of Lee's actions are important and what could transform a character from your best friend to your worst enemy, or vice versa. It all comes down to the decisions you make as a player, and while we're on that topic, let's dive into how The Walking Dead deals with player choices and how they hold up as one of the pillars of the series. Now, one of the most common criticisms of Telltale games is that players feel like their choices don't matter, and that they don't have a major impact on how the story progresses. Decisions and consequences can be big or small, and the consequences of some decisions aren't made clear immediately, but sooner or later the game deviates, even if slightly, based on what the player has done. But despite the player going through several substantial choices and countless minor ones in each episode, The Walking Dead doesn't have any significant branching paths in terms of the overall progression. No matter what the player chooses to do and say, Lee will always be bitten, and he and Clementine will end up in that storage unit. Not to mention, many choices only end up making a superficial impact, like changing one line of dialogue or triggering a small side conversation later. And even the big choices only have a limited number of options, so you aren't given full control over how you handle a certain situation. But that argument isn't exclusive to The Walking Dead, as you can say that about any game that places emphasis on player choice. It's impossible to give a player total freedom regarding in-game decisions, so instead the developers will program specific scenarios that play out depending on what you select. And since games need to lead to a conclusion regardless of player decision, the developers can't allow the player to stray far from the main pathway. Even in games with multiple or dynamic endings, choices are designed not necessarily to give players the most freedom, but rather hide the fact that they're directing you down a linear path. The Walking Dead is no different, as you won't radically change the course of events just by playing. But does that mean your choices automatically don't matter? Well, while your decisions won't have a huge impact objectively, they can make a huge difference in how you connect with the characters and events. The Walking Dead is all about raising the stakes of the current situation and heightening the tension of what's happening around you. Very rarely do the characters need to make long-term decisions. Instead, they're busy focusing on how to proceed through whatever they're dealing with at that given time. And when the player only has a limited amount of time to make a choice, you feel the need to make the right, or at least the best, decision. The game intentionally forces you into terrible situations and has you make a snap decision, and that can lead to some guilt or a desire to change what you've done later down the line.
But I can't stop seeing him in my head.
We can't kill ourselves over
We killed that boy. We could have saved him together.
We did what we could. Bad things happen. We didn't make a choice that killed Sean. You think you do when you look back on it, but in a moment, when things are really out of control, you don't have any choice.
I guess.
That's the strongest element behind the choice system, because it reflects how you act under pressure. You won't have enough time to fully consider how each option will affect the game or Lee's status with the other characters, so often you need to make a decision based on a cursory glance of your possibilities. It adds an intensity and sense of immediacy to these choices, unlike in other games where characters can just stare at each other forever until the player chooses something. Your choices may not matter in the grand scheme of things, but they matter in the moment, and that holds true across the entire series. Plus, if your decisions weren't important, they wouldn't have the impact that they did on people who experienced the game for the first time. When players look back on this season and the series in general, they remember the moments that made them happy, that scared them, that got them angry, and that made them cry. Even if it's just for a brief instance, a player's choices absorb them into the story and make them feel responsible for what happens next. Of course, this is based on an illusion of choice, and that illusion is easy to spot in hindsight, especially if you play the game multiple times. But when you go in blind, not knowing where the game is taking you, the scenes where the player is forced into making difficult moral and ethical choices are all the more powerful. That's why the ending is so unforgettable, even if it doesn't change all that much on each playthrough. If you've played the game before, you know this ending is inevitable, but when people played this scene for the first time, they responded with anguish and distress. It shows how Telltale crafted a story around player choice while still constructing a unified narrative that everyone could experience. If this ending could have been avoided, the game wouldn't be as fondly remembered as it is. Lee needs to die in order to tell the player that their choices may have an impact, but that they can only change so much, and the fates of many of these characters, whether we like it or not, are set in stone. Season 1 garnered widespread acclaim, generating over $40 million in revenue by January 2013 and winning numerous Game of the Year awards. It also shoved Telltale into the mainstream, as they were credited not only with providing a monumental video game narrative experience, but proving that adventure games could be successful in the modern era of gaming. Suddenly, the company was expected to produce more episodic adventure games with hard-hitting stories, and they were ready to deliver. In 2013, Telltale released The Wolf Among Us, which received similar praise and did moderately well, but never reached the same level of popularity as The Walking Dead. What fans were really looking for was The Walking Dead Season 2, which, thankfully for them, was basically guaranteed. The contract Telltale made with Robert Kirkman conditioned a multi-year, multi-platform, multi-title license, and since Season 1 was a major success, Telltale could move forward with a second season. Initially, the company wasn't sure who the protagonist would be, considering that Lee was out of the picture. The developers wanted Clementine's story to continue, but went back and forth on whether or not to design a new character to act as her guide or let the players take control of her. Eventually, they decided that having Clementine as the player character would lead to more interesting scenarios, as well as strengthen the bond between her and players who guided her along previously. The writers also imagined darker situations that would make Clementine grow as a person and come to terms with what happened in Season 1. The first episode of Season 2 launched in December 2013, but earlier that year, Telltale gave fans a small taste of things to come with the release of DLC content for Season 1. In July, Telltale released The Walking Dead 400 Days, a side story designed to bridge the gap between Seasons 1 and 2, and before we move on to the second season, let's take a brief look at this DLC. 400 Days centers around 5 protagonists who each have their own small scenario where they deal with the Walker apocalypse. The DLC follows the characters at various points in the first 400 days of the outbreak, taking place before, during, and after Season 1. The scenarios are mostly self-contained, though if you play them in chronological order, the choices you make in one scenario can alter minor details in later ones. And while the stories all feature Gil's pit stop as a common location, the characters don't form a connection with each other until the end. 400 Days reads your Season 1 save file and will occasionally reference events from that game, but it is mostly unrelated to Season 1 and doesn't give you any advantage in Season 2 if you complete it. Rather than set up the story of Season 2 or give players a clue as to where Clementine's story is headed, 400 Days provides a glimpse into the world of The Walking Dead at large. Season 1 was a largely insular narrative, but 400 Days compiles individual stories that paint a bigger picture to the walker infestation and how it's affected humanity and society. In Season 1, the characters are learning to survive in the post-walker world, and in Vince and Wyatt's scenarios, that holds true as well. But Russell, Bonnie, and Shell's stories take place several months after the infestation, and by this point the survivors have adjusted to the walkers, accepting them as a reality and even using them to their advantage. But while the walkers slowly become less of a problem as the days go on, 400 Days also expands on a core idea to the comics and Season 1. In this series, the Walking Dead are not the only danger, and not every living human is necessarily a good person. The zombie outbreak may unify some people into working together, but it also tears people apart and causes some to lose their grip on reality. Society as we know it has collapsed, and a new type of society has risen up, one where its citizens must learn how to survive. But survival means something different to everybody, and many are willing to sacrifice others in order to make it through unharmed. This is what the world has come to, as the infestation not only gives rise to a new external threat, but also reveals the inner darkness of humanity. When society crumbles, some will try to rebuild it and others will reject it, acting according to their own rules. But for many, the only thing they can do is keep moving, staying alive day by day, hoping they'll eventually find a place where they can settle down. And that's where Season 2 begins. Season 2 opens not long after Season 1 ended, with Clementine traveling with Omid and Krista, seemingly the only other survivors of Lee's group, as they continue to wander the ruins of the United States. But when Omid is killed, Clementine and Krista wander together until 16 months later, where Clementine is separated from Krista after scavengers attack them in the woods. Now on her own, Clementine is forced to survive without any help until she comes across a group of people living in a cabin in the woods. The group takes Clementine in, but they're running from a terrible past that's about to catch up with them, and Clementine is swept up in the ensuing chaos. While the first season centered around Clementine learning to understand the realities of the post-zombie world, Season 2 is dedicated to showing her how to survive and take care of herself and the people around her. Clementine was too young in Season 1 to defend herself on her own, and needed the help of Lee and the rest of the group to make it as far as she did. But she's 10 years old in Season 2, and throughout the game, she needs to learn what it takes to live by herself. We see this right in the first episode, as when the cabin group believes she's been bitten by a walker, Clementine is forced to steal medical supplies from them and patch her wounds herself. It's a stressful moment not just for the player performing the surgery, but also for Clementine, as it's the first time she's confronted a situation like this and didn't have anyone by her side. It also marks a shift for the player's relation to Clementine, as while they previously acted as her guide, they're now right there alongside her, struggling to balance personal survival with keeping the group alive. Clementine was forced to grow up rapidly following Lee's death, and that's reflected in her personality. As a young girl in Season 1, Clementine expressed a wide range of emotions, but was mostly cheery and compassionate even when everyone around her was despondent.
Hey Lee, do you think you'll ever have kids?
I don't know. I haven't thought about having kids in a long time.
But by Season 2, she's haunted by her past experiences and the state of the world, and isn't able to find as much joy or excitement as she once could.
I always wanted a sister. I used to make my babysitter Sandra play a game that we were secret sisters. It was stupid kid stuff.
Melissa Hutchinson performs Clementine with a somber, flatter voice than in Season 1, which reflects the character growing older and shows how scared and depressed she is after going through Season 1's events. Clementine shows remarkable maturity for a girl her age, which on the one hand is good because it allows her to learn the skills and knowledge needed to survive the zombie apocalypse. However, it's the circumstances of how and why she grew up so fast that reveals the tragedy of Clementine's character growth after Season 1. The reason why Clementine is who she is in Season 2 is the terrible events she experienced in Season 1 and all the trauma and heartbreak she suffered. Of course, there's Lee dying, but there was a constant stream of hardships that Clementine had to endure that makes it difficult to keep up her sunny disposition for long. Witnessing Larry's death at the hands of Kenny and potentially Lee, seeing Duck slowly succumb to a walker bite, being kidnapped by the stranger, discovering her parents have turned into walkers, the list goes on. Add on top of that the zombies and survivors who have no qualm about killing her, and it's no wonder she becomes who she is in Season 2. But with some exceptions, none of what she's dealing with is her fault. Her naivete did get her into trouble on occasion and is partially what led to Lee's death, but many of the scenarios she went through were brought on by other people, and she was forced to endure it whether she liked it or not. And it doesn't stop when Clementine grows older either, because if the world of The Walking Dead is anything, it is consistently rough and uncompromising to everyone, no exceptions. Season 2 is the darkest game in the series, not just because it ramps up the bleakness and horror, but also because it places Clementine right in the thick of these terrible events. The game doesn't let up the brakes in terms of what Clementine has to go through, as right out of the gate, Clementine must deal with the death of Omid and Krista's growing bitterness towards her. Just like Lee, Clementine will learn through harsh experiences that her actions have consequences, although in her case, this lesson is much more cruel and painful. When characters got angry with Lee, you knew that he was mature enough to handle them in a responsible, if sometimes tough, manner. When characters get angry with Clementine, it often comes across as cold and resentful because she doesn't yet have the mental or emotional fortitude to fight back when she's being yelled at.
You think because you're a little girl, you can just get people killed and no one will care? That because you're sorry, it'll all magically go away? That's not how it works!
Interactions like this lead Clementine to need to figure out who she can trust, as she no longer has a guardian to make that decision for her. She needs to look after herself, and that means knowing who is going to get in her way and getting past them. What makes this so difficult for Clementine, and the other characters, is one of the main themes of Season 2, the need to move on. In The Walking Dead, nothing lasts forever, and no matter how prepared you are, you could lose someone or something valuable in an instant. At any moment, a person you care about could be killed and you have to run to avoid meeting the same fate, leaving you no time to say goodbye. Season 2 tells its characters that they need to get past everything they've done, but also to the player that they must help Clementine move beyond the events of Season 1, and especially Lee. Players had such an emotional connection to Lee that they imparted that connection into Season 2, and still felt like they were in his role even when controlling Clementine. However, Telltale designed the story to break down this idea and show how Clementine changes from a follower into an independent force. Players tried to look for another character to take up the mantle of Lee, perhaps the good-natured Luke, the lone wolf Jane, or the returning Kenny. But Clementine can't rely on other people to guide her forever. Season 2 puts her in many dangerous and bleak situations to drive home the point that she's now on her own in this crazy world. Nobody else can protect her because they're consumed with anger and bitterness, and spend so much time placing blame on other members of the group to care about teaching Clementine what's right and what's wrong. Thus, she needs to come to terms with what's happened to her in order to successfully take care of herself and the group, moving beyond her past and looking ahead to what's coming. This is most prominently shown through the birth of Rebecca's child AJ, an event that is teased throughout the season and that has a major impact on the story going forward. AJ not only represents new life in a world being consumed by the dead, but is also an indication of hope for the future. Clementine and the survivors take it upon themselves to raise AJ after his mother dies, but while Clementine eventually becomes a mother figure to AJ, the others prove to be completely unequipped to keep him alive. The people Clementine travels with in Season 2 are initially a strong band of survivors, but when it comes to planning for the future, they reveal themselves to be a dysfunctional group. The survivors are running from a man named Carver, never knowing how far he is from finding them and constantly worrying about if everything will catch up to them. It's been over a year since the Walker Plague began, but the characters are still struggling to survive, and after spending so long worrying about keeping each other safe, they're all fatigued by having to keep on moving. That leads them to make careless mistakes that get themselves and others in trouble, which just adds to the guilt in their minds and leads to the cycle being repeated. While this was also true of Lee's group, keep in mind that they were only a few months out from initial contact, so they only had so much experience dealing with walkers. After over a year of fighting zombies, many have grown tired and have either given up on living or on establishing relationships with other people. A big part of that is being tethered to their memories of the past, especially the years before the walker infestation. Now more than ever, these characters want to go back to how life was before, a time where they could enjoy themselves without fear that they could be dead any minute.
You just spend so much time trying to stay alive that you don't get a chance to enjoy living.
Yeah, we need to make more time for that.
But in a world like this, being obsessed with the past is a death sentence. You need to focus on what's ahead of you and figure out how you need to adjust to a new way of living. Because that's what the apocalypse is in the grand scheme of things, a way to determine how people can adapt when the world suddenly changes in drastic, life-altering ways. It's a test of will that everyone needs to go through, but just having the will to survive isn't enough. You also need to act in the interests of humanity to ensure that justice is carried out and to forge communities that stick together no matter what. The Walker pandemic can't be stopped, and wanting it to end so you can go back to the way things were is pointless and potentially dangerous as well. If a survivor can't adjust to life after the walkers have invaded, they put their lives and the lives of others at risk. But most of the survivors in seasons 1 and 2 are adults, people who were in the midst of living full, normal lives before the zombie plague. We often take for granted how much normal life means, and we value it most often when a worldwide disaster threatens to take it away from us. That makes it difficult for the survivors to move past it because they've spent decades building a way to support themselves in a regular world. And it's also why Clementine, even though she's little, is in some ways better equipped to deal with this type of situation. She may have only been 8 when the walkers started appearing, but that means she doesn't have as much attachment to the way things were. She still misses aspects of her former life, but Clementine isn't as tied to that past as the other characters are, which makes it easier for her to focus on the present and the future. But that introduces another problem. What happens when you focus too much on making your own path and putting personal safety ahead of everything else? What kind of person do you turn into when you lose sight completely of what it means to live a normal life? That's the path Clementine set for herself, and as she moves beyond everything that's happened, so too was Telltale moving on to something bigger. Something that would lead to their eventual demise.